particularly as I think transparency is very important this morning. And so I should say that in the 70s and 80s I was a BBC journalist, and in the 90s I was a policy advisor to John Birt. Any other declarations?
Yes, I'm a former BBC reporter and news presenter and news anchor.
For BBC presenter and manager.
I've worked for the BBC for some years and am occasionally in receipt of royalties.
I was a very junior person at Yalding House in the 90s.
Kelly?
I have attended events and received hospitality from the BBC in the past.
I have attended events and received hospitality, although not in the last year, I don't think.
Okay, thank you all. And welcome to Richard Sharp, the chair of the BBC. Thank you for agreeing to come before us this morning. I want to start by trying to establish the facts about the loan arrangement with the then Prime Minister, which was being set up at the same time as he was making the appointment of the BBC chair. Essentially, from what I've read, there were three people involved: Sam Blythe, Boris Johnson, and you, Mr. Sharp. Who started the whole procedure? Who approached who first?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to clarify these issues, because, as you say, there's some confusion. And I should point out, I believe it was actually 2 years ago that I was subject to the scrutiny for the appointment. It wasn't a year ago. And I should also want to make it clear that I've never given financial advice to the former Prime Minister. He's never asked for it. He never received it from me, and I'll get into the details of our relationship. The starting point, in the way you described it, is my long-standing relationship and friendship with Mr. Blythe. He's somebody I met after he'd left university, and after I'd left university some 40 years ago. So Mr. Blythe is a personal friend of mine who I've known for some time. As a result of press reports that he had read in September, he raised with me at that time his concern that his cousin, the Prime Minister, was reported in these press reports to have some difficulties. Mr. Blythe raised with me the fact that he was interested in feeling about whether he should do something to help. He raised that with me at a private dinner at his house. I said to him at that time, "You may be a family member, but you need to be very careful. Things need to be done by the book. There are rules in this country, and these rules exist for a good reason. You're a foreigner, and therefore, before you contemplate doing anything or providing any assistance to the Prime Minister, you should involve the Cabinet Office." And that was he raised that issue with me, and that was the end of it at that point in time.
And that was in September?
Yes, correct.
So what was the position then with your seeking the BBC chairmanship?
Okay, well, so I should explain. When the pandemic arose, there was clearly a national economic crisis, and the then Chancellor asked me whether I would come and work for him as a special economic advisor to the Treasury, and in supporting industries, in particularly large companies, as they needed capital to survive during the pandemic. So I focused on industries such as steel, etc. We can go into more detail. But at that time, therefore, I was working, because of the pandemic, the operations were run out of number 11 Downing Street, which is, as you know, is a connected office with the with number 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. It's a sort of related thing. So I was working there, and then during that period of time, round about, I think, October, the existing speculated front-runner, Charles Moore, for the chairmanship, withdrew. Now, I had at that time, I should also say, been working on special film insurance to keep the film industry going, which uniquely in this country we achieved with 50 to 100,000 jobs at stake. and also the Cultural Recovery Fund, putting that in place to support throughout the country cultural institutions. And that put me in contact with a lot of people from the media world. And albeit that in my prior, we discussed this before, my prior working experience, I had worked with media companies. This was a new experience for me. So, and some of my friends at that time suggested to me that I should consider applying for the job. So I was working in effect at home and in Downing Street. It was during the pandemic, and if I can remind you, it was before the first vaccine. It may have just been discovered, but it hadn't been provided. But it was pretty clear to me that a lot of the bulk of the work that I had to do, I had done, and I was very interested in the prospect of working, submitting my application to be the chair of the BBC, and I did so.
So this was happening at pretty much the same time. So you'd been told by Sam Blythe in September that he'd taken your advice as to whether he should help the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And in the following weeks, you thought, okay, I'm up for this job.
Yes.
Because in a sense that's what's relevant. Because given that you clearly say in September that you realised that there were propriety issues involved, did it not occur to you at that point that because you were applying for a job that the Prime Minister of the day would appoint, that you should say to him, look, whatever you want to do, that's fine, it's a matter for you, but I can't be involved because I'm applying to be chair of the BBC?
It may be, it's almost hard to recall the time then, but actually what happened at that point, if you recall, was there was another lockdown when you worked from home. So you worked in the office if you needed to. I was working, and to me that was an after-dinner party comment, and that was no more than that. And that was the last I'd heard at that point from Mr. Blythe on the matter. I didn't see him after that.
What, so you never discussed it with him after September?
No, the next moment I had any contact from Mr. Blythe on that matter was when he called me and said, I'd then submitted my application. I basically communicated to the Prime Minister and to the Chancellor that I wished to apply, and submitted my application in November. Following that, towards the end of November, I received a call from Mr. Blythe saying that he was interested in exploring with the Cabinet Office what possibly he could do to help his cousin. And he asked me if I'd put him in touch with the Cabinet Secretary. That was a phone call I received from him at that time.
And so you did put him in touch with the Cabinet Secretary?
Yes, so I then arranged to go subsequently, and we can go through the sequence. I then met the Cabinet Secretary and got his agreement that he would, at least that I could pass his number to, following that, I passed his number to Sam Blythe to get in contact with the Cabinet Office.
So your meeting with Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, was purely to discuss whether he would speak to Sam Blythe?
Yes, it was to tell him that Mr. Blythe was interested, I had spoken to Mr. Blythe. Mr. Blythe wanted to explore ways that he could help the Prime Minister. And therefore he asked to be introduced to the Cabinet Secretary. And then at that meeting, I raised with Mr. Blythe the fact that I had submitted my application to be the chair of the BBC, and that therefore, to avoid a conflict or perception of conflict, I could have, and we agreed, no further participation in whatever transpired whatsoever, and I didn't.
So you acted as a sort of introduction agency.
Exactly what I did was ensured that due process and propriety was followed in the interests of what Mr. Blythe had learned from me, was that was an entirely appropriate thing to do in the context, despite the fact he's a family member. And I should also say, I'd also mentioned to him that he was a foreigner, and therefore there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed that could prevent him from providing any support whatsoever. And the best people to address that with would be the Cabinet Office. Hence, he asked me to he rang me up asking me to put him in touch with Mr. Case.
All of that seems fine, but I'm still not clear why you needed to go and have a meeting with Simon Case to say there's this guy who wants to help the Prime Minister and there may be propriety issues, so you want to talk to him. Because that seems overblown.
No, well, I was working in the same office operation. Clearly, Mr. Case didn't know Mr. Blythe at all, and Mr. Blythe wanted to have contact with the Cabinet Office in the way I described.
And the other thing, the Sunday Times reported a dinner party attended by you and Mr. Blythe in November 2020. Did that happen?
No, that's a factual inaccuracy.
Did they just get it wrong, or?
Yes, they got it wrong, and they've acknowledged that subsequently.
Okay. But one other thing.
A dinner did take place, but it took place in May, and that was after I was the chair of the BBC, and that was the dinner I took the opportunity of, as I then subsequently discussed with the Director General, to promote the interest of the BBC to try and get an effective licence fee settlement.
You've said this morning that you never provided financial advice.
Yes.
And yet there's a Cabinet Office note from Simon Case to Boris Johnson saying, given the imminent announcement of Richard Sharp as a new BBC chair, it is important that you no longer ask his advice about your personal financial matters. That seems to contradict what you've just said.
Well, I haven't seen that memo.
Well, it was in the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago.
I haven't seen the memo itself. I've seen the report of the memo, obviously. And in fact, I discussed that with the Cabinet Office. What Mr. Case undertook to me, and I was very grateful for that at the meeting, he said, I will ensure you have no further part in this. And I had no further part in this. And so that memo, and in fact, I discussed this with a Cabinet official, because I only learned about this over the weekend when as you did, when a journalist put that to me. I learned from the Cabinet Office, it did refer to the meeting that I'd had with Mr. Johnson, which was alerting him to the fact that I was going to go and see Mr. Case. And at that meeting, I did not provide Mr. Johnson advice. And I think it was an ambiguous construction that obviously is open to misinterpretation. I've never given the Prime Minister advice. He's never sought it. I know nothing about his personal financial affairs. And so I take it that phrasing, and I had that confirmed to me unofficially by the Cabinet Office before the article was written, was that referred to the fact that their efforts were to prevent me from receiving any calls from the Prime Minister to protect my position and to protect his, for that matter.
That's an interesting reading of the phrase, it is important that you no longer ask his advice about your personal financial matters. That clearly implies that he had asked your advice.
He had not asked my advice.
So Simon Case is wrong.
Well, that phrasing is wrong. So I don't know who wrote that memo. I don't know if Mr. Case wrote the memo. I heard that somebody else might have written that memo, rather than Mr. Case himself. But I did not provide and have not provided the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, personal financial advice. I know nothing about his affairs. I never have done his financial affairs, and I wouldn't provide him financial advice.
When you say nothing, presumably you knew because
all I knew was press reports.
Was press reports that he had financial issues, and you were facilitating.
I have no interest in providing him financial advice or getting involved.
Somebody would help him. So what
my interest was to introduce Mr. Blythe to Mr. Case, because Mr. Blythe wanted to help the Prime Minister, and I wanted to ensure, at his request, that there was a process by which all the rules could be followed appropriately.
Did you ever give informal advice as a friend of Boris Johnson?
No.
About
No. Our relationship is broadly professional, and it has been broadly professional rather than personal.
That's interesting as well. One of the other things, as you know, there's been a huge amount of newspaper coverage of this. I read that you're one of the people who actually calls him Al.
It's actually Mr. Blythe that calls him Al. I call him Boris.
You call him
Prime
like
Minister.
Those
yes, exactly.
Know him professionally. Yeah. So what we learn then is that this memo.
It's a family term, I gather.
Yeah, indeed. No, I've heard Joe call him that, but very few others. So what we learned is that the Simon Case memo is just inaccurate, or the Cabinet Office memo. A piece of advice for the Prime Minister about his propriety, the propriety of his actions, was pretty glaringly inaccurate, and indeed potentially damaging to you, because you had said, I've never given, you were continuing to say, I've never given him financial advice, but there's a Cabinet Office memo suggesting you did give him financial advice. That memo itself seems to me, from your point of view, unbelievably shoddy to come out under the Cabinet Secretary's name.
Well, I didn't write that memo. I believe it was written by somebody who wasn't at the meeting I had with Mr. Case.
There was nobody at that meeting, I understand.
Beg pardon?
There were no minutes taken at that meeting, so that meant it was just you and him in the room.
You know, I think he took notes. He told me.
He
took some notes. For example, he noted, and he reminded me. He reminded me that I'd raised with him specifically, proactively, the fact that I was being considered for the BBC chairmanship, and I raised that with him at that meeting.
And after that meeting, did you ever discuss with him or Mr. Blythe or Boris Johnson anything about Boris Johnson's financial affairs?
No, I never had. Frankly, I hadn't thought about it at all until a couple of weeks ago, when I got called by a journalist. I had nothing to do with it whatsoever. I'm not party to anything that then happened or didn't happen. I have no knowledge of a bank. I have no knowledge of the actual loan. I've no knowledge of that. I have no interest in it, candidly, until I got a call back from the journalist.
Okay, John Nicholson.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Sharp.
Good morning.
Why did you tell this committee, that you helped facilitate an £800,000 loan for the man who then gave you this plum appointment that you now hold?
I didn't facilitate a loan.
You introduced the person who gave the loan to him. The person who gave the loan told you that he was going to help the Prime Minister with what you call his difficulties. You facilitated it because you made an introduction knowing that it was about money.
I introduced Mr. Blythe to Mr. Case. I did not introduce Mr. Blythe to Mr. Johnson.
But nonetheless, you knew what the score was, and you didn't tell us about it. Let me remind you of what you signed up to on your BBC application. It says the following: you cannot be considered if you fail to declare any conflict of interest. Clearly this was a conflict of interest. It continues, any issues on your personal or professional history that could, if you were appointed, cause embarrassment or public confidence to be jeopardised must be disclosed. This clearly causes the BBC embarrassment. Why didn't you disclose it?
Just to be clear, I didn't arrange the loan. I did at the meeting.
You helped with the loan. The loan would not have happened, presumably, if you hadn't played the role that you did.
As I said, I was ensuring due process was followed. I can't speculate on what would have happened or not happened had I not had the meeting with Mr. Case.
But tell us why you didn't disclose it.
The meeting I had with Mr. Case explicitly addressed the issue of my candidature for the BBC. And in talking to Mr. Case, I'm talking to the most senior civil servant in the land, and within that area is proprietary and ethics, as you know.
Yeah, but you did disclose it to this committee, that you clearly should have done. Let's continue and have a little look at the timetable as the chair. There'll be plenty of time, and let's try and kind of go through it relatively snappily. Now, the application's closed for your job in November the 11th, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a meeting with Boris Johnson before you submitted your application, about your application, a meeting when he said, let's make the BBC great?
No.
You didn't discuss your job application before you submitted it with the Prime Minister.
I'd like to answer the question, if I may.
Please do.
I did go to Mr. Johnson to tell him that I wished to apply to be the chair of the BBC. That was not the meeting where he told me, let's make the BBC great. He asked me why I wanted to do it, and I told him at that time why I wanted to do it. And because I care about the BBC, and I thought I could make a significant contribution. I'd made a contribution to the Treasury.
Yes.
I'd supported the industries.
I
And
can understand why you
he-
wanted the job, Mr. Sharp, but I'm just trying to get through some of the details. So
Yes.
you had a meeting with the Prime Minister before you submitted the application. Now, it's important to remember who the board was for this. It included a Tory party donor plus the wife of Boris Johnson's former Spectator chair, so not exactly a hostile board. And you were such a shoo-in for this that, according to Robert Peston, ministers told other applicants not to waste time submitting their applications. So let's look at Boris Johnson's loan. As we've heard, his cousin approached you at a dinner party and said he wanted to give Boris Johnson a lot of money because, again, to use your phrase, he was in some difficulties.
He did not say that.
He didn't say he wanted to give him money.
No, he didn't. He said he wanted to help him.
Well, what does that mean?
Of course, it implies that it could be money or anything else. He didn't say a lot of money.
Right, so let's not dance on the head of a pin. He wanted to help him out
Yes.
of his difficulties because the Prime Minister couldn't manage on his £164,000 salary. I'm still not quite clear why he didn't, since he was a cousin, just ask Boris Johnson directly. Do you want some cash, cuz?
Well, again, I'd say that you. It's probably worth recalling what was going on at the time. We had no vaccine. We faced a national crisis. We had an economy that was collapsing, potentially. We had no vaccine. And he was concerned that his cousin should focus on the job.
Quite. So the cousin would have taken the phone call, clearly, if he phoned up and said, I want to help you out financially. Now, originally, we've discussed this.
May I come back to answer?
Yes, please, perhaps in the next answer. You told journalists that the dinner was in November 2020. Now, you've said that the journalists have said they got that wrong. The Sunday Times journalists actually said that they think you got that wrong in the initial briefing that your representative gave them. But that's, we can leave that to one side, because, of course, it would have been illegal to have had a dinner in November because COVID lockdown was on. So you now say that the conversation with Mr. Blythe was in September. In other words, before you applied for the BBC chairmanship post.
Yeah.
So Boris Johnson knew you were helping him effectively with the £800,000 loan when you applied for it.
No, he didn't. He did. He first of all, I did not help with any loan. Just to be clear,
Facilitated.
I think the detail, as you said, matters.
So made the introduction. So Boris Johnson knew that you'd made an introduction between him and his cousin, who apparently needed introduced to him, even though he was his cousin, and you'd made that introduction. £800,000 was the figure, huge amount of money, and Boris Johnson knew that this was happening, was in the pipeline before you applied for the BBC chair post.
With respect, Mr. Nicholson, there are a lot of things you just said are incorrect, and if you may, I'd like to answer them in detail.
Please continue.
Is that right? Thank you. So when the dinner that I had with Mr. Blythe was in September, and at that time there was no figure mentioned at all. There was no mention of it being a loan. It was clearly financial, but there was no specific figure, and I actually don't believe that there has been any knowledge of what financing has been provided, and all I have seen is Mr. Blythe commenting publicly, saying that the amount speculated is wrong. So,
but that doesn't mean much. It could be 750 or it could be 950. We knew the scale of the Prime Minister's difficulties were sufficient that his multi-millionaire cousin needed to step in and help him. So let's not dwell on the exact amount. It was a lot of money.
May I address some of the other issues you raised that I think
Yes.
are correct? Okay. So, as I said, when I when I went to meet the Prime Minister and told him that I wanted to apply to be the chair of the BBC, at that point I hadn't heard from Mr. Blythe asking me to put him in touch with Mr. Case. So as far as I was concerned at that time, that was something that had happened in a dinner party conversation in September. And when I had the conversation with the Prime Minister about wanting to apply to be the chair of the BBC, that I had no knowledge at that point that Mr. Blythe was doing anything to take it anything further forward.
So you didn't say to the Prime Minister, your cousin's looking to help you out?
No, I did not.
Okay, so although you discussed the loan with Mr. Blythe, Boris Johnson's cousin, in September 2020, you didn't actually go to see the Cabinet Secretary until December, so quite a long time afterwards. At that discussion with the Cabinet Secretary, did anyone else attend? Were any minutes taken?
Well, this comes back to answering one of your earlier questions, which is, at that meeting I raised with the Cabinet Secretary that I was in the application process for the BBC chairmanship. And therefore, at that time, we discussed precisely that to avoid a conflict, or the appearance of conflict, I should have nothing further to do with it. At that meeting, there were two people. I was there and Mr. Case was there.
So nobody was taking notes. Now, you told the media show...
Mr. Case was, I believe, taking notes.
Yeah, but you would have expected a civil servant to be right there rather than the Cabinet Secretary taking his own notes. Now, you told the media show that you told Boris Johnson you were going to see the Cabinet Secretary about the loan. So when Boris Johnson says that you knew nothing about his financial affairs, and to quote him, he was ding-dang sure about that, well, that's obviously untrue.
Well, what he knows is that the only information I have about his financial affairs are the same that you have.
Right. So you knew that he was in dire straits financially, despite his huge salary. So, and you'd been involved in a discussion with his cousin about that. Did you tell anyone apart from the Cabinet Secretary about this conversation with his cousin?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so you didn't tell your interview panel at the BBC. You didn't tell the DCMS Permanent Secretary because she's told the Public Accounts Committee that she'd been left completely in the dark. And as we've established, you didn't tell us, but we know that the Cabinet Secretary was uncomfortable because he sent a letter telling Boris Johnson to stop seeking financial advice from you, and you've already covered that, so I think we can leave that. But the nail-biting application process was over, you had the job, and you went off to celebrate at Chequers. Now, I understand that it was Sam Blythe who invited you to Chequers. And he said, and I quote, "Do you want to come to Chequers? I'm going to have dinner with Al." In other words, Boris Johnson. So you were effectively his +1, is that correct?
Can I come back to something you said earlier, which is about the fact that having had a conversation with Mr. Case, where I'd specifically raised the issue of and proactively raised the issue of my BBC application, that he had agreed that to avoid a conflict or perception of conflict, that the issue was resolved by my not being in any way further involved in any process or any discussion about what would then transpire. And that is why, at that point, as far as I was concerned, the matter had been resolved with respect for the need for disclosure.
Yeah, but the Cabinet Secretary was alarmed about this. But I want to pursue the Chequers dinner for a second, because it strikes me that his cousin Sam Blythe and Boris Johnson had become very pally at this stage, which is surprising because only a short time previously you'd had to introduce them effectively, although they were cousins, or you'd had to act as a go-between to the extent that you've described.
Okay. May I address those points? Mr. Blythe first met Mr. Johnson when Mr. Johnson was a little boy. I did not introduce him to Mr. Johnson. I did not introduce...
You reintroduced.
I did not introduce Mr. Blythe to the Johnson family in any way. He was known to them. You correctly characterised me as a go-between. As a go-between, I was not between Mr. Blythe and Mr. Johnson, but I was actually seeking to ensure that due process was followed by ensuring that Mr. Blythe had contact with the Cabinet Office before he would do anything to help his cousin.
At the Chequers dinner, did you talk about the loan?
No, I didn't talk about anything about the financing or anything that transpired as a result of any contact that Mr. Blythe would have had with the Cabinet Office.
I've heard you say that you talked about the licence fee at that dinner. You talked about the licence fee, you lobbied about the licence fee in front of Mr. Blythe,
Yes.
the cousin, which seems strange. Were civil servants present?
No, it was a dinner.
So nobody was taking notes at this Chequers dinner?
Correct.
When all this blew up, of course, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, William Shawcross, was due to investigate, and you welcomed that. But after a week, he recused himself because he said he'd met you. Well, you clearly met a lot of people, and I'm guessing it must be more than that. What's your relationship with Mr. Shawcross?
Well, I think I've met him in the last 15 years maybe 2 or 3 times. I think the last time I was at a dinner with him maybe over a decade ago. But he is so... I know of him. I know some of his relatives by marriage.
Have you ever been in business with him?
No.
Have you ever discussed business with him?
No.
His daughter is a senior number 10 aide, and his son-in-law, Simon Wolfson, like you, is a Tory donor. So do you think that's the reason that he's recused himself? Have you spoken to him about why he recused himself?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Will you resign if the inquiry criticises you for withholding information?
Well, I'll need to see what the inquiry produces.
Well, if the inquiry says you should have told the members of the interview panel about the loan that you helped facilitate, the introductions that you made, if they said that you should have told this committee, that'll be pretty clear. Will you resign?
Well, just to be clear, I was subject to a very rigorous interview process. I needed to be considered appointable, if you like, and recommendable. As you know from Lord Dacre's experience, any preferences don't necessarily guarantee that independent committees form that view. And I'm confident that in that sense, that not only was I appointed my merits, but I also am confident that my subsequent performance at the BBC...
Although you previously applied for a job in the BBC board, am I right?
I applied to be a non-executive. They had a different structure at that time.
Yes.
And I applied to be a non-executive on the management board, not the governance board.
And you didn't get the job?
I didn't actually get an interview at that time.
What do you think the difference was between your failed application then and your application now following the huge facility that you helped the Prime Minister with?
I did not help the Prime Minister with a huge facility.
Have you any idea how angry BBC staff are with you?
Look, I regret the distraction this has caused. There's no doubt about that. And certainly I'm, disturbed by the fact that all the tremendous things that the BBC is doing should anyway be overshadowed by this. I'm sure, like most of the rest of you, well,
they're absolutely furious, and I've had a huge mailbag from BBC staff about it, and a recurring question, one of many things they're angry with you about, is the fact that you're not a journalist, but inexplicably chose to sit on the selection panel for the head of news position.
Would you like me to address that issue? Is there a question there?
Yes. Do you understand why they're angry about that?
Well, if they're angry about that, then they don't actually understand, and we need to do a better job of explaining the governance of the BBC as it currently is. May I go on?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a unitary board, and I'm the non-executive chairman. Now, the detail matters. So, for example, if you look at Netflix, they have an executive chairman. And the non-executive often gets overlooked in terms of the meaning in corporate governance. But really what it is to draw a bright line between the executive and how they execute and the board in terms of owning the strategy and the issues the board deals with. And in a unitary board, and this detail is very important in terms of governance, the board has certain critical functions to do. And if you look at those functions, they critically own the strategy, they own the creative remit for the BBC, they own the budget and they ensure value for money. They have to have, and this goes to our purposes, a framework for assessing the BBC's UK public services, including the World Service. They have to have a policy on the distribution of the public services.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to have to interrupt, because otherwise you'll read out a big long list.
Okay,
you were on the board.
May I come back?
No, I want to pursue that point. You were on the board for the Director of News. That is a journalistic appointment. It is not appropriate, I don't think, and BBC staff don't think, for you to be on the board for a journalistic appointment, albeit that it has board implications. It was fundamentally a journalistic appointment. And I think if I could summarise really in closing, I'll let you come back after this. What appalls, I think, so many BBC staff is that you got this job with no BBC experience. They knew about the vast donations to the Tory party that you'd given, but they didn't know about the £800,000, something that you withheld from the interview panel, the DCMS Permanent Secretary and this committee. And I think it leaves the impression so much of this is deeply establishment. It's pals, appointing pals, donating money to pals, and I think, as I said in the chamber, it rather leaves the impression that it's all a bit banana Republican cosy.
May I come back to the question of the appointment of the head of news, which I think is quite critical. And the reason I was outlining the board responsibilities is because the board is composed of a majority of non-executives and also executive directors on the board. And the executive directors, there are 4 of them, including the head of news, have a function to deliver as members of the board and directors to perform that function. And it is absolutely in the Charter that the nominations committee of the board gets involved in the appointment of board positions. So when I met Deborah Turnus, it was following. First of all, she reports as the Director of News directly to the Chief Executive, who is the Director General. There was a management board that went through the process of determining candidates. So the meeting that I attended in terms of the selection of Deborah Turnus as a member of the BBC was quite properly for her to be a member of that board to fulfil those functions on the board. And it is in a requirement of the nominations committee, it is in the charter of the nominations committee, that they should interview and be part of a process of appointments to the board, and that includes the executive directors. So my involvement in the appointment of Deborah Turnus was precisely what I should do as the chair of the board with other members of the nominations committee who sat on that session to determine her capabilities to contribute to the board as a director of the board with that list of functions that I outlined, which are critically important. With respect to her position as Director of News, she reports to the Director General.
Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Mr. Sharp.
Good morning.
Just to clarify something you were saying earlier, before you went to see Simon Case about this matter, I'm right in saying you did go and see the Prime Minister to tell him you were going to see Simon Case?
Yes, I had a meeting with the Prime Minister. I told him I was going to go
what
to see
did you
Mr.
tell
Case.
the Prime Minister you were going to meet Simon Case about?
I told him that Mr. Blythe wanted to support him. I told him that I had advised Mr. Blythe, or I told Mr. Blythe, and I informed him that there are rules in this country, and that therefore, as a result of that, he should be in touch with the Cabinet Office, and as a result of that, I was going to do so.
But you did, in effect, inform the Prime Minister.
I've definitely informed
that
there
was
I informed the Prime
somebody
Minister
who had
Mr.
approached
Blythe.
you who wanted to lend him money to support his lifestyle.
Well, I informed the Prime Minister that Mr. Blythe wanted to meet the Cabinet Secretary to see whether he could help the Prime Minister.
And the implication of that is whether he could help him financially.
Yeah, definitely.
So although you didn't offer direct financial advice to the Prime Minister, the point you were making earlier on, you did inform the Prime Minister before you met the Cabinet Secretary that there was someone who had approached you,
Yes.
who was a member of his family, who wanted to help him financially. So in effect, without giving financial advice, you had discussed his finances, or rather the fact that somebody wanted to help him with his finances with the Prime Minister. That's correct, isn't it?
Correct.
Can I just ask you, is there anything else you haven't told us or hasn't been reported that might be perceived as a potential conflict of interest in relation to your appointment to the BBC? You know why I'm asking that, don't you? Because you didn't tell us about this before. So I'm just to clear the air on that, there is absolutely nothing that you can recall of anything that might be perceived as a potential conflict of interest in relation to your appointment that you haven't told us, or told the appointments panel, or told anyone you might be expected to tell.
Look, I think in the circumstances that's absolutely a fair question. And the answer is that having had the meeting with Mr. Case on this particular issue, and having discussed the BBC application, and that Mr. Case put in place issues to ensure there was no conflict or perception of conflict, I did not raise it with this committee when you were questioning me.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And just to be clear as well, have you discussed with anybody else, or did anybody else approach you, or you discuss with them ways that you might assist Boris Johnson with his finances beyond Sam Blythe? Is there anyone else at any time who's discussed it? So it's only Mr. Blythe. This is the sole occasion where you've been
Blythe
involved
is a friend of mine,
facilitating.
And he happened to be a cousin of the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And he raised the issue of wanting to help the Prime Minister, and I told him he should talk to the Cabinet Office.
And I'll come back to that again.
I've had no discussions like that with anybody else.
Despite your previous answer, I'm still not clear why you didn't tell this committee about your role in facilitating an introduction to someone who wanted to loan money to the Prime Minister at the time. I'm not clear why you didn't tell us.
Because I'd had a meeting with the Cabinet Office, I had a meeting with Mr. Case. I'd raised the issue of my BBC application specifically with him, and he had agreed that to avoid a conflict or any appearance of conflict, I should have nothing further to do with the matter.
You're asking
and
us...
At that stage, any support that Mr. Blythe was going to provide was entirely hypothetical. And I took comfort from that discussion I had with Mr.
I've heard
Case.
your answer, Mr. Sharp, which you said earlier on, and quite frankly, I don't think it's good enough, to be honest with you, in relation to what was expected of you as a candidate. I know you said you were scrupulous in the way you went about this appointment, but if you actually read the questionnaire that you filled in before you appeared before the Select Committee, if you actually read the rules in relation to what you should declare in front of an appointments panel and so on, the fact that, well, let me put it to you this way. You're asking us to empathise, I think, a little bit with the process you went through. How about trying to empathise with somebody who's a member of this Select Committee, whose constitutional duty it is to examine somebody who's being appointed as chair of the BBC for two reasons. One, as to their competence to do the job, and secondly, as to their ability to do that job independently, with full disclosure of any information that might call that into question. And you were probed quite deeply at the time about your connections, previous political connections and donations, and the committee, despite that, was able to recommend that you did cross, you were above the line and you were appointable to this particular position, but you hadn't disclosed to us in full the potential conflict of interest that you were required to disclose by the rules, that you knew very well you were required to disclose, which might have called into question and at least should have been available to the committee to consider in relation to your potential independence as BBC chair. Isn't that an absolutely fair observation?
I had raised the issue of my candidature with Mr. Case.
I know that.
And I raised it with Mr.
I'm asking yourself to put yourself in our shoes for a moment.
Yes.
If you were sitting on this committee, wouldn't you be just a little bit disgruntled, so I put it that way, about the fact that when you appeared before the committee, you chose not to tell us about this?
Well, look, I think one of the reasons why I'm welcoming this opportunity is because there's been a lot of assertions about things that have taken place.
I'm not making any assertions of that kind.
Which have mischaracterised, as far as I'm concerned, my involvement. My involvement was to ensure due process was followed. Well, I was not party to any subsequent events that took place. I gave no financial advice to the Prime Minister. I gave no financial advice to Mr. Blythe.
Well, look, we're going over old ground, but I'm not asking you that, am I? I'm asking you to put yourself in our position for a moment, in our role in this matter. And if you were sat in the House of Commons whilst ministers prayed in aid, this committee's report, when it interviewed you in the pre-appointment hearing, to say nothing to see here, and when they're appearing all over the media saying, oh, the DCMS Select Committee said it was fine, so there's not a problem, and you're a member of this committee, and you find out that in fact you did not disclose to this committee the fact that you were involved in making introductions which would result in a very large soft loan facility being made available to the very person responsible for appointing you to the job which was under consideration. How on earth did you think that was not a relevant matter to disclose to this committee?
Well, as I've described,
do you regret it?
As I've I'll come back to that particular. As I've described to you, I acted in good faith to ensure that due process was followed, including an open declaration to the Cabinet Secretary about the issue occurring at the same time I was applying to be the BBC chair.
I mean, you
With
could
respect-
say, you
with
might as well
respect-
just say I refer you to the answer I gave previously in true House of Commons style, but do you not see why we might be unhappy about that?
With respect to the regret, obviously, I regret the situation. I particularly regret the situation for the
That's
BBC.
a non-regret though, isn't it?
No,
I
it's
regret
not.
the
It's not at
situation.
all.
Do you regret your actions in not telling the committee that you had been involved in this caper?
I took, at the time, as I told you, comfort from the conversation I'd had with Mr. Case.
When Mr.
That
Blythe...
the issue resolved a conflict and a perception of conflict.
And I don't want to... that's on the record, so we can read that back in the record. When Mr. Blythe approached you about helping the Prime Minister, did you at any point consider, given the position and the fact that you were considering and then were actively pursuing the position of chair of the BBC, did you actually at any point consider saying simply, sorry, I can't help?
Knowing that I'd had the conversation with him in September, when he called me up asking for the introduction to Mr. Case, clearly, I could have at that time said no.
Yeah. Why didn't you?
Because I felt that I could help ensure that due process was followed.
Didn't you think of saying, I can't help because I'm in the middle of an appointments process for a very high-profile public appointment, chair of the BBC, which, by the way, the Prime Minister will have the final say over, the very person we're talking about. What kind of an idiot do you think I am? That I can, in the midst of that process, that I would think it was appropriate to get involved in an affair of this kind?
Well, I could understand why, knowing, as he did, that I worked in the same complex as the Cabinet Office, and that he wanted me to make Mr. Case aware of both his existence and his desire to talk to Mr. Case. And I felt that actually my participation was to ensure that due process was followed and the rules were followed.
I'll tell you what I would have said
Yes.
to him. I would have said, firstly, it's not my job to have anything to do with bailing out the Prime Minister and his personal finances and his unaffordable lifestyle. And I would have said, more importantly, I'm a candidate for this key public appointment. And I would have said, I'm sorry, Mr. Blythe, you're going to have to ask somebody else. Why didn't you say that?
Well, that is why I proactively raised it with the Cabinet Secretary when we met.
Why didn't
issue.
you say, isn't you're a member of his family? Why don't you ask his brother, Joe Johnson, who chairs the board of a company on which you sit on that very same board? Why didn't you say that to him?
I don't know Joe Johnson particularly well. What I do know is that Mr. Blythe is a friend of mine. Mr. Blythe.
He chairs the board, Joe Johnson, of a company that Mr. Blythe is a board member of.
This was during a very difficult time in terms of people meeting other people, as you can remember.
It's reported he's very close friends with the ex-Prime Minister's father and brother as well as being a family member. Didn't you think, saying, why don't you go and ask Stanley or Rachel Johnson instead of asking me?
He knew that I had been on the Financial Policy Committee of the Bank of England. He knew that I care about following the rules carefully. And he turned to me for advice in what would be a sensitive matter. And he acted on the conversation we'd had at the dinner, where I told him that he needed to be in touch with the Cabinet Office. He knew that I was in the same operations, physical operations, as the Cabinet Office, and he asked me if I'd put him in touch with the Cabinet Secretary, and I did.
Here's what I think. Had I been approached in this way about helping out financially the person considering me for and responsible for appointing me to a big controversial public appointment, as you already pointed out, I wouldn't have said, sure, no problem. I think I would have heard clanging alarm bells and the dive klaxon of a submarine going on in my head at that point, knowing full well the process I was about to embark upon in relation to this public appointment. Wasn't it a monumental failure?
Well,
a judgment on your part to go ahead with this?
I did not believe that ensuring that due process was followed was in itself a problem.
That's how you dress it up, but really you were helping out somebody who wanted to lend money to the Prime Minister when it was not your job to do that.
No, I was ensuring that Mr. Cates was in a position to get the advice before he would contemplate doing anything involving the Prime Minister.
See, to me, it's just inconceivable, going back to the committee, that in good faith you thought it appropriate not to reveal your involvement in Mr. Johnson's finances, albeit, as you've pointed out, at one remove, to the appointment panel when you were going for this job, and then to this committee. And I think that any reasonable and fair person would come to that conclusion. Would you agree with that?
I'm seeking to lay out the facts here, and the facts are that a fair and reasonable person would see that what I was trying to do was to ensure that due process was followed, that in fact in introducing Mr. Blythe to the Cabinet Secretary, or seeking to introduce Mr. Blythe to Cabinet Secretary, I was ensuring that somebody who wanted to support his cousin was going to go about it in the right way, and that my involvement was to ensure that due process was followed, and that was what I was seeking to achieve.
I may be wrong, but on reflection, I would have thought that a thoughtful person like yourself would realise that deep down inside it was the wrong course of action to take, and that you should have told this committee about it. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kevin. Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Sharp, you've just said any fair and reasonable person would think X, Y and Z. You've said that you want to put the facts on the record. That's not a fact, that is your opinion.
I was responding to a question.
Yes, but it's not a fact, it's your opinion.
Yes, correct.
And I would disagree that any fair and reasonable person would come to the same conclusion as yourself. In fact, I don't know anybody that I've spoken to about this who would come to that conclusion. Now, I don't know everybody in the country, but I know a lot of people. At any point, even if what you did was technically not breaking any rules, at any point during this process, when you were coming before this committee, did it not cross your mind, perhaps I should mention this?
Candidly, no. What happened, as you'll know from, I'm sure all of you have reread the transcript of the...
Many times.
And
I remember not just the words, but the inference that you were very blasé about, it was 10 years since you donated anything to the Tory party, as if this was some sort of distant, long-gone connection, and that you'd only donated a relatively small amount of money in political terms to one person. But the whole manner in which you answered those questions, which I think is as important as what you said, was that this was a distant, long gone, I don't do this anymore kind of thing.
Well, it was quite clear to me at the meeting that we had that you were aware that I'd had a long-standing professional relationship with Mr. Johnson, and that I had been invited back into the Treasury to work during the pandemic, and that I knew Mr. Johnson professionally.
But you didn't think it appropriate to mention that you'd, as you've said, rang the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to tell them he wanted to apply, that there'd been this transaction going on that you had played a part in. You didn't think it appropriate to mention any of that.
Well, that's why I took. That's why I'd raised the issue with the Cabinet Secretary, and before I met with you.
No, Mr. Sharp, you really have to answer the questions, because this reflects badly on you, not on us, when you don't answer the questions.
I'm seeking to answer the question.
I asked you, did it not cross your mind to mention this to this committee?
I'm seeking to explain that, if I may. I'd had a meeting before I met with you, which was, I think, in early January or mid-January. I'd met in the beginning of December, as I said, with Mr. Case, and I think that the details of that meeting are very important in terms of how it influenced me in respect to this particular issue you're asking. And the fact that I'd raised the issue with him, and he is the Cabinet Secretary, and also within the Cabinet Office is the Proprietary and Ethics, gave me significant comfort in my mind when we discussed that this was that the process of me being excluded would resolve any conflict or perception of conflict. It gave me significant comfort in my mind that the issue had been resolved. And that is why, when I met with you, as far as I was concerned, I was no party to anything, had no part in anything, and the issue was not in my mind with respect to a conflict.
But
and you're asking what was in my mind.
How this could be seen as a perceived conflict?
I can see, with the benefit of hindsight, particularly with some of the assertions that have been made, that is a perfectly legitimate issue for you to raise.
And the chair of the interview panel, Sarah Healy, who's at the DCMS, told the Public Accounts Committee that the public appointment panels typically ask whether there is anything else that we ought to be aware of which, if it came to light, might embarrass either the government or the organisation responsible. Do you remember being asked that question?
The interview was 2.5 years ago. I don't remember all the details, but I think I do remember that question being asked, and I said no.
And you think that was a fair answer to
well,
that question?
I've explained to you precisely why, as far as my mind was concerned, and I believe now, that is why I felt comfortable, having had the conversation, explicit conversation. It was an explicit conversation with Mr. Case on this issue, that my introduction of Mr. Blythe to Mr. Case was not in itself that particular issue. So that was why, as far as I was concerned, the issue had been resolved.
It might have been resolved, but you are very well aware of the high scrutiny that your position that you now hold has and has historically had. Anything connected to the BBC is under huge public scrutiny.
Yes.
And it's a bit like when you declare pre-existing medical conditions on an insurance form. You might break your leg and you might have a breathing condition, but they won't pay out on you breaking your leg if you haven't declared your breathing condition. Did that kind of thing not cross your mind, that even if you think you didn't do anything wrong, and you might not have done anything wrong, did you not think that, well, even though it's sorted and it's happened and it's done, that I should actually just mention this, that people might be interested in this?
Like you, and I think like the Chair and Mr. Nicholson, it's manifest that this has caused embarrassment to the BBC, and I regret that. And I explained to you at the time why I did not think so, but it's very clear, particularly as my involvement can be mischaracterised and has been mischaracterised, that my activities in seeking to ensure that Mr. Blythe met Mr. Case or the Cabinet Office were involved, clearly that activity that I undertook before that interview.
But Mr. Sharp, it's almost irrelevant what exactly happened, what the exact conversation, who said what, who met what person, whatever. It's the fact that you were involved in any way, shape or form in this loan arrangement, even if it was simply directing them to the Cabinet Office, telling the Prime Minister that you were going to see the Cabinet Secretary, even if that was the level of the involvement, which is what you say it is, and we've got no reason to understand it's any different. even if that was what happened,
Yeah.
what I can't understand sitting here is how you did not think that applying for this job and coming before us at a pre-appointment hearing when you'd got through the interview, that at that point that you something in your thought process didn't think, well, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, I need to be, open and transparent about all of my actions, that you didn't mention it, that you didn't think it fit to mention it. It just does not add up.
Well, at that time, and again, I think, I appreciate the question. At that time, as far as I was concerned, when I met with you, this was some weeks, 4 to 6 weeks after I'd met Mr. Mr. Case. At that time, as far as I was concerned, I knew nothing of any arrangements that were going to transpire, and therefore, I'm explaining to you why, as far as I was concerned.
The arrangements are not really relevant. It's the fact that you are sitting there freely saying, I had this conversation, I spoke to the Prime Minister, I went and had a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary. You're sitting there freely saying, I did all of this. That's the bit that should have been sent to this committee, in my opinion. And that's the bit I don't understand why you didn't do that.
Well, I'm explaining. Because I'd had a conversation with Mr. Case concerning the specific issue, and we had agreed that I would be excluded in a way that ensured that it wasn't an issue that needed to be raised, or a conflict, or a potential conflict. And I wasn't advised that that was something that needed to be raised. And at that time, and I appreciate your opinion now, at that time, that was, as far as I was concerned, the end of the matter.
I mean, it sounds sitting here that you were hiding it. That's how it comes across. That might not be what you were doing, but that's how it comes across. That's what your answers sound like to me, that you just thought, this is never going to come out. I don't need to mention that. Is that not what you were thinking?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Charles Watley.
Thank you, Chair. We've covered an enormous amount of ground about who met who, what, where, when, why. I'd like to move slightly on. You called for an investigation, BBC. Briefly, why did you do that?
Well, the issue that was raised was one of conflict and perception of conflict. And one of, obviously, my regrets of this issue is that it affects the BBC. And therefore, I felt it appropriate in the circumstances to reassure the people of the BBC that there would also be an independent investigation by the nominations committee.
Which you chair?
No, I won't be chairing that particular committee. I recuse myself from that, to investigate that our declarations are in order.
Right. What is that? What you expect the investigation to find? That all is in order?
Yes, but it's being independently reviewed.
And that is since your appointment. That investigation will cover
Correct.
that ground. And
Correct.
the investigation by William Shawcross, who also recuses himself actually as Commissioner of Public Appointments. What do you expect that to find?
I believe that I was appointed on merit. I believe that all due processes were followed, and I believe he will find that out.
You said that this whole matter is a distraction, and that you're really sorry about it all. You said that, and having said that, and in view of your comments earlier about perception, do you think perhaps that your position as chairman is now perhaps untenable? Do you think that you can, or do you think you can weather this particular storm?
Look, I believe I've made a significant contribution to the BBC. I've laid out the facts here, and I think it's important to separate those from the things that are not true. And the reason for that is because some of the press has contained significant inaccuracies, and on the basis of those inaccuracies, there's no doubt that that has had an effect on some of the people from the BBC, and that's why I'm grateful, actually, to be accountable to you, to subject myself to this particular scrutiny, because I want to set the record straight. And, I appreciate, for example, the questioning from Ms. Elliott. But it's very important to come back to the point that I've never provided financial advice to the Prime Minister, that I'm not party to any situation that arose, and it's speculative to know what actually happened. I have no knowledge of what happened, and that my involvement in this was precisely to ensure that due process was followed and that everything was done correctly. And subsequently, I've had informal confirmation from the Cabinet Office that that is their view of my participation in this process. I recognise the difficulty that I put this committee under, and I regret that. But at the same time, this is important because I wanted to create some clarity, because there's been a lot of noise and a lot of mischaracterisation and a lot of erroneous facts
yes,
that have been put out there.
In sort of your defence, I'll say that just a quick glance at your CV, you've been in charge of governance of non-profit organisation, Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Marsden Institute of Cancer Research, and you worked 23 years as a partner at Goldman Sachs, and it may well be that you are absolutely the right man for the job. But despite that, the very fact that you're here answering these questions today in public, don't you think it might have made it impossible for you to continue?
Well, fortunately, I have had the chance to meet many. I've been in situ for 2 years, almost 2 years, and I've met, for example, all the employee networks. I've communicated in that sense directly with at least half to 2/3 of the people of the BBC. I believe that they are in no doubt about my commitment and ability to make a contribution to the success of the BBC. And in addition, I think that they understand my belief in public service and the importance of it. I think, for example, you will look back a few weeks' time and see my aggressive support and championing the World Service. And the people of the BBC expect that from the chair. And therefore, I do believe they, whilst I regret what this has happened, of course, I do believe the people of the BBC know that I'm striving to protect the BBC and preserve it and make it successful, and that I can contribute. And therefore, of course, this has had an effect on the people of the BBC. But at the same time, notwithstanding some of the messages that Mr. Nicholson has had, I've had a lot of messages of support from people within the BBC, which I welcome. And I would say to any of the people who have expressed their disquiet in text to Mr. Nicholson, my door is open to them, and I'm happy to discuss this particular issue with them directly.
I think you've answered my next question. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Charles. Simon Jupp.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Sharp. Throughout this entire session, you've mentioned about press inaccuracies in reporting. Is the BBC guilty of that?
From time, you mean in general or specifically in relation to this?
In relation to this case.
When they have repeated inaccuracies from attributing it to other journals, they're guilty. They have been guilty of that. They have subsequently made corrections if they found themselves to be in possession of inaccurate information.
Does that concern you? As the chair of the BBC, the organisation in which you chair, the one that you were tasked with, sorting out with regards to impartiality, bias, all that kind of stuff, have in themselves failed that editorial process, in your view?
No, I think it certainly made me personally more conscious of the value of the BBC in striving for impartiality and accuracy above and beyond other organisations, and it's also made me aware of the consequences of inaccuracy in a very personal way, yes. At the same time, I'm proud of the BBC in the way that we do report. We will, and we do, and we have done from time to time, got things wrong. And the issue in relation to that is how we address them when we get it wrong, and that we should correct and acknowledge our mistakes. We will make mistakes as an institution, but we will also, in my judgment, both presently and in the future, define ourselves as the most impartial and accurate news
But now you've had this experience, at the sharp end of the BBC's very own editorial decision-making. How does that impact on your role as chairman? Is that something that you think is a potential conflict when you're discussing this in the future with members of your own board?
No.
Okay. I'd like to, if I may, move the conversation on to conversations you'll have had with other politicians, particularly the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, for as long as that department exists. What discussions have you had with the Secretary of State regarding the future funding arrangements of the BBC?
Well, I've had a series of meetings where I've sought to outline the beginnings of our approach to our strategy and what our needs are. Because I think funding should follow strategy and needs. It shouldn't precede it. And obviously one of the issues we face is significant global competition, and we also have a requirement to provide a universal service, and we are operating in a very highly inflationary environment. So before the current before the current Ukrainian issue caused unusual inflation issues, the media industry, when the CPI was 2%, was already facing 9% inflation. And we face a budget that in some ways doesn't add up. And therefore we face very difficult choices. And therefore I felt that the Secretary of State, in considering issues associated with the licence fee, needs to understand and get across the detail of what we're seeking to achieve and the budgetary implications. And so that's the process we're undertaking.
Yes. How do you think that was received?
The meeting.
The conversation, setting out your...
I think with great interest.
Right.
Yes.
With sympathy?
I think it was received, yes, I think it was with great interest, yes. But of course, we're operating in a currently nominal flat licence fee environment, and that will only change in about a year and a half. So I think we're really talking about prospective financing issues rather than current ones.
Now, in your
Although I beg your pardon, there's one thing I should add, which is what I highlighted in my speech a few weeks ago, which is, as a result of the budget, we face a considerable issue in whether we can justify to domestic licence fee payers the world service that we do in both to address a global audience and to do it in foreign languages, for which licence fee holders directly do not receive a benefit. And if you remember, you would remember before the discussions with George Osborne when he was Chancellor, that was separately funded away from the BBC. And certainly I have made the Secretary of State aware that I do believe we will need additional funding in order for the World Service to achieve its remit successfully.
The good news is my colleague Rupa is very keen to ask questions on the World Service. She'll do so after I finish my session. You previously described in the pre-appointment hearing, which we've discussed a couple of times this morning, the licence fee is the least worst option. Do you still subscribe to that view?
Well, there are issues with the licence fee. It's regressive. In some ways, it's considered anachronistic because, and there are other countries adopt other mechanisms, and there are a number of issues in terms of how they fall on individuals, both in terms of how we collect the licence fee, for example, pensioners, and also the issues arising from people's failure to pay the licence fee, including, for example, how that falls with respect to gender issues. So it is imperfect. And other countries are adopting household taxes. There are some broadband taxes. And there are different ways to ensure that a public service broadcaster is separately funded.
Do you have a preferred option to replace it yet?
No, I don't have a preferred option now, and I also think the BBC should contribute to that and that discussion when it arises. But that really has a lot of policy implications for you as representatives of the people in making that judgment.
Understood. Now, previously on this committee we've held a session with members of BBC management regarding BBC local radio. We've just been touching on the licence fee. The licence fee is clearly paid for by communities, and now the BBC is looking to cut back on the services closest to those communities in BBC local radio. When was the last time you listened to your local BBC radio station?
I do listen to the local radio stations, and in fact, I use the sounds, if you like, flywheel to listen to other local radio stations. And one of the issues I do is because actually in London, to my concern, with all the competition, we only have about 1.5% of the market. And so one of the things, I do believe a defining advantage of the BBC is localism. But one of the things I do in thinking through the strategy for the BBC is how we achieve that. And when I look at the market share that we have, I have to ask myself, as we think about the strategy to delivering localism, how we can do that and also maintain an effective local radio station.
London, if I may, is an isolated case with historically low audiences through several relaunches, none of which have worked. But the more widely, services like the one in my county of Devon are very popular with audiences.
Yes.
So do you regret the course the BBC is taking, which will, for example, completely wipe out local programming outside of sport every weekend on most local radio stations?
The conundrum we have is where is the audience and where are they going, and how do we reach the local audience and to deliver the local information. And I
understand the conundrum, having worked in local radio myself. I understand that, but we are talking about audiences that are not served by any other service.
Yeah.
Because local commercial radio barely exists in this country anymore. And, community radio has popped up across the country, but that's limited and specific to certain areas. BBC local radio, whether the BBC likes it or not, targets and has a loyal audience of people over 60 who listen to its services.
Yes, look, I think, one of the things that defines us as a public service broadcaster has to be effective localism. There's no question about that. And it is an issue of how we accomplish that is a real challenge, because of where audience are migrating to and where they're choosing to spend their time. So the data is incredibly important in terms of whether how the community will participate with BBC output in whatever form. And I certainly hope we get it right with a combination of local radio in offering a defining local advantage, but also with our websites, so that people do believe that the BBC is delivering to them precisely what you talked about, which is a sense of community and engagement.
On these websites,
yes.
It's been mentioned to me several times by editors of local newspapers in my patch, that that will impact on their ability to maintain their local paper, because of course local papers have diminished, demised across the country, much like commercial independent local radio. So are you at all concerned about the competition that will create and the impact it will have on the printed press that still exists in communities like mine?
Well, I've had meetings with the local newspapers' representatives, and it's also clear that the BBC can act as a channel, our website can act as a channel to provide them with a larger audience on their own websites. In addition, what the BBC can do is also provide some financial assistance to local newspaper reporting, and we do that. Yes. So I do think there's a synergistic relationship that we can provide with more dedicated local news entities, like local newspapers and their websites, by collaborating with them rather than purely competing with them. So, for example, if there's a fire, for example, in a particular warehouse, we can put the links underneath.
Just before I hand over in a second back to the chair, obviously the original local radio proposals were vast and cut swathes of local programming. The revised proposals tinkered at the edges. Is that the final situation for local radio? Is that the end of the discussion, the end of any movement on how those local services will be portrayed in the next couple of months? Those staff who are currently facing the sack, those programmes that will no longer exist that are loved by audiences, is that it?
Well, broadly, I've explained that we face a real budget crisis at the BBC in terms of...
I get all that.
The
answer is quite direct.
So the answer is no, because if you take, for example, a controversial restructuring that's taking place at the moment, which is in radio foil. There we have put it out to consultation, and we are in discussions with the unions, and we will, as a result of that, make adjustments, and we are listening and seeking to ensure that we continue to deliver and we continue to employ where possible to deliver.
We haven't got
that
much time because this process is ongoing, and clearly, staff are under notice of redundancy. People are preparing to lose their programmes with an uncertain future. When will this be finalised? When will we see yet another tweak from the BBC in relation to local radio?
Well, this is a consequence of having a very difficult budget, having a nominal flat.
We understand
that we have to try and achieve the same output in a more efficient way, and unfortunately, that is accompanied often by seeking productivity increases, which amounts to fewer people doing the same or doing more.
But you haven't answered my question. When would you, given the process is ongoing, given staff are currently facing the sack, or being moved around, or jobs they don't want to do in different parts of the country, and there's uncertainty over whose programme will be done by which presenter, etc., etc., etc. When do we expect, the final lineup, the final plan for local radio? Given we've had 2 iterations already.
Well, look, like any corporation, we're having to constantly change and create productivity efficiencies. We've had to take 30% out of our budget.
I know.
So in that sense, it's never ending. It's sort of what I'm getting to. Is we're constantly going to have to adapt to the marketplace, the needs of the consumers, our obligation to deliver local public services, and it's a constant management challenge.
Okay. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Dr. Ruber-Huck.
Thanks, Chair, and hello again, Mr. Sharp. Look, I'm not going to rake over this murky, undisclosed loan gate because I wasn't there in 2021, but I mean, can you see how objectively, to someone like me or to an alien from another planet, it looks like there was a distinct lack of transparency when you came to this committee and your application was in, that when are there any skeletons in your cupboard question came, it wasn't revealed.
Look, I can see now, certainly with the benefit of hindsight, that there are facts that I've shared with you about my introduction of Mr. Blythe, seeking my seeking introduction to Mr. Blythe in this case that you weren't aware of, and I've heard loud and clear that this committee wish it was aware of it.
I mean, are you grateful for the role of investigative journalism in exposing this? Because without that, we wouldn't know at all. We'd all still be in the dark.
Well, look, I think it's, as much as I'm at the cutting edge of this in that sense, I think it's one of the things that makes this country great.
And you would welcome more transparency. The other thing is, I mean, you're someone who's had dealings with both the current Prime Minister and the previous one. Is there a sense that this could be past and previous Prime Ministers briefing against each other? Because we know we've got a former Prime Minister who's been to the US, to Ukraine, to Davos in a I'm still here way.
I have to say, most of my career was in the private sector. And in most of my career, there wasn't, if you like, leaking that happens, in a sense, in the public sector domain. So I have no judgment as to motivations or issues, or I have no judgment on that. I don't know what the source of this or what the intention behind whoever chose to deliver a memo to the Sunday Times. I don't know what their motivation was.
Okay, we don't know where it came from. And just my last little one on this. What do you see the role as the Cabinet Secretary? We know that you met him without other officials minuting it. Just curious to know.
Well, the Cabinet Secretary I see as the most senior civil servant in the country. Under him comes proprietary and ethics. And I see his role to advise on any matters which touch on, in this case, the Prime Minister's affairs, insofar as they need to be managed in a way that conform to the rules of proprietary and ethics.
Because it feels to me, when I did politics A-level in the last century, we were taught that the Cabinet Secretary, I think it was Sir Robin Butler at the time, was the most powerful man in England and Wales maybe. And it was the head of the Home Civil Service, but Scotland as well, okay. But it feels like now it's turned into a fixer for the government, sort of thing. A fixer for the PM, that you can go and meet him behind the bike sheds without it being minuted. That's what it feels like to me.
Okay. Look, I think the Cabinet Secretary took a minute of my meeting. He took notes, and there was a memo that followed. So it was a meeting in the office, in that sense, and it was, a disclosed and noted meeting.
Okay, I mean, that's all I'll say on that, but hurrah for investigative journalism. I just noticed that BBC is currently advertising for corporate affairs execs. I think on pretty big salaries. The most recent ones come from Primark, for example, so someone who's come from the private sector. Is this really a good look when you're sacking journos and local radio presenters, and when huge swathes of the World Service are having the plug pulled on them?
Well, I think we have to run ourselves like any corporation in one sense, and that is we do have to manage our communications. For example, if you look at the situation in local radio, how we communicate, how we manage our involvement with stakeholders has to be professionally managed. And we need a team that can do that can ensure that takes place appropriately. Plus, in addition, we have to manage communication with the regulator. We have to manage communication with Parliament. We have to manage our communication with different governments within the UK as well. And we need to do so professionally. And that's why public affairs is very important, so that we do that properly.
I mean, a journalist friend of mine, you said that all the journalists who've communicated with you have been very sympathetic, but I represent a lot of BBC staff. I'm an ex-BBC staff myself, I have them in my family. One of them said to ask how much that corporate band E is, what sort of salary these corporate affairs executives getting compared to your average journalist.
Well, I mean, one of the things...
6 figures, isn't it?
One of the things we do at the remuneration subcommittee of the board is ensure that the pay that we make is appropriate. And in fact,
can you tell us in numbers what that is?
Well, I can tell you that we have failed to hire people.
What's the current going rate?
Because we aren't financially competitive with the private sector. It's a great difficulty for us to recruit people for key positions at the BBC. And in terms of the specifics of that position, I don't have that off the top of my head, and I'll have to come back to you.
Right. Okay, I'd be curious to know. You're going to write to me about this on record. Okay. The interview that you did in the Sunday Times on December the 3rd, when you said the BBC should be run more like Goldman Sachs, and you're no Marmaduke Hussey, I think the title was More Guts and No Liberal Bias. We know that part of your job as chair is to uphold and display independence from government. Is this sort of bias that you want to steer clear of only liberal biase?
No.
The fact that you sort of very publicly had a go at Emily Maitlis in that interview.
I think, obviously in this community, people look at biases in the sense of partisan political issue. One of the things we've done is also look at thematic issues associated. And if you look at Professor Sandbrook's recent articles, for example, he talks about the fact that the issues about bias are not around party politics, but they're around issues of subject. So, for example, we had a thematic review to look at impartiality in the context of tax and spend, which came out very recently. We're going to have one, I don't know if we've announced it yet, on migration, for example. And part of our approach to impartiality is to look at it more broadly around topic areas and how we approach topic areas. Because, and then I know, for example, Mr. Nicholson has addressed this, AI is another source of potential bias. And if you if you look at some of the recent issues associated with AI as well, there will be biases, cultural biases, and political biases emerging from those areas as well. So these issues we do look at, and part of my job is to ensure, which is why we've had the 10-point impartiality plan, is that we look at biases in the broadest possible sense, and party political bias is only one element of that, and increasingly less important to our audience than some of the bigger issues.
I mean, when you say I will fight BBC liberal bias, it looks like it's only in one direction. And an applied example I want to give you, Simon Jupp said I'm going to talk about the World Service. We know that, you just said actually you will aggressively champion the World Service, but we know that it's an 85 years running thing. The relative cost actually of 28 million, it's 0.5% of your spend, 0.001% of government spend. It's a tiny fraction compared to the soft power that we get out of it. We know that these countries where news is censored, it's a vital lifeline. You know, this is London calling for years and years has been the truth. My cousins in Bangladesh used to say, we listen to the BBC when we want the truth. And there is a suspicion that, so why is this being done? I think you could find the money down the back of the sofa. It seems, you know, when you're hiring these people on six-figure telephone number type salaries to do your corporate affairs, the structure's all going in that way. There's a report in the Voice newspaper, 3rd of February, that there was a Zoom with BBC Africa. They were told that they're all for the chop. No consultation. Is that a way to treat staff? Somebody on that call said this right-wing government are moving away from engagement with the continent of Africa. So this seems to be that, do you know what I mean? You take one bias and tilt it the other way. And we know in that interview you were fondly talking about how Rishi Sunak worked for you in the 90s, then he was your boss at the Treasury, you're good mates with Boris Johnson, brokering his loan. It just all looks like you're trying to bias in another direction.
I don't have the detail on the Africa situation you're talking about. I doubt if that is the case, and I will look into it.
I mean, it just seems that you're sort of substituting a previous bias for it, which may or may not have occurred. Again, the attacks on Emily Maitlis, who was seen as an investigative journalist, the stuff that she did with Prince Andrew, are you not worried that there's even a kind of brain drain away from yourselves? A lot of big names have gone. Andrew Marr, Andrew Neil, they've all walked.
Look, first of all, Emily Maitlis is a very fine journalist. I've always said that, and I believe that. So I wouldn't want that to be mischaracterised. We have lost talented people, but we also have a considerable amount of talented people within the BBC to fill those positions. And it is often true that for an organisation to work, you need fresh water flowing through it. Absolutely regret the loss of talent, and sometimes that's financial as well. You know, we aren't competitive with the private sector, and so you know, I'm touched by the amount of people who will work for the BBC, recognising they could earn considerably more in the private sector, but that the pressures of the pay and inflation in the media market and overcapacity in our well-funded competitors is going to continue to put a drain on our resources. That's unavoidable in the context of the financial constraints that we're operating within, and that is a competitive issue for the BBC that we need to be concerned about.
I mean, the decimation of local radio that Simon Jupp referred to, again, that's going to cut off the normal pipeline that these people come up through.
Well, we are we're seeking to make local radio more efficient. We're not seeking to end local radio. You know, we should always remember that if you look across, and this is partly one of the things that inspired me to come to the BBC, that the BBC plays a central role in the whole creative industries. We've lost, if you look at many of the independent film producers, if you look at much of the talent that's in the private sector, look at yourselves, many people came through the BBC and go into other professions. And that's part of what we do as a public service to the United Kingdom. As part of our training exercise, where we populate well-trained people in the creative industries. And that's something we should continue to do as a public service broadcasters in that sense. And in some ways, welcome our contribution to the UK in nurturing talent and allowing it to flourish.
I mean, everyone understands the need for modernisation, but is the merger of the news channel and BBC World going to erode your ability to serve communities of the UK, all communities of the UK? The fact that small quirky stories find exposure on the BBC News channel, that for it's a different audience altogether.
Look, there's no doubt that part of our public service remit is to provide an adequate, an excellent domestic news service. And this comes back to something we discussed earlier. This is an initiative from the executive to create operating efficiencies between our worldwide news and our domestic news, using technology to ensure that as far as the domestic audiences are concerned, they receive an adequate news. I'm sure this will be looked at by Ofcom as well in terms of are we fulfilling our remit, and it will be looked at by the board in that sense after we see how the final product is delivered. And I'm sure that in doing it, they're conscious of the need to satisfy the domestic audience that they're receiving an appropriate service.
And will investigative journalism, things like Inside Out, survive this?
Well, it's up to the Director General to determine which shows go forward and not. But part of the BBC's remit will include, I'm sure, continue to include investigative journalism, both domestically and globally, including in Africa.
And I'm grateful. I think last time we were talking about minority, black and ethnic programming, and so there's been some U-turn on that, so I have to give you credit for that. Grateful for that. But can you give that assurance that current journalists will have a future in the BBC? I think I asked you last time and you weren't able to say so. So we know that there's been some rowing back of the slashing of those programmes.
Well, this comes back to making it clear the difference between my position as a non-executive and the executive. The journalists don't, in that sense, work for me. What is important as far as we're concerned at the board level is that the evaluation systems are fair and that people retain their jobs and get promoted on the basis of merit. And so I can't speak to the individual journalists, and they should and do have no more, in that sense, no more security than they do in the private sector. But we have to have processes that ensure that we retain the journalists that we have on merit.
Yeah, because there is a worry about losing all this expertise, and apparently on this BBC Africa call, journalists on there were offered a week's work experience, sometimes people that are given decades of their life.
Yes. Well, I think that's one of the things that makes the BBC great, is the quality we've had of BBC journalists who have actually had a period of longevity and experience within the domain that they operate.
Okay, I mean, I hope in this new merged news channel stroke BBC World, because we've all appeared on the domestic channel sort of thing, and if all that's squeezed out for, I don't know, some global Britain thing that the government wants, it's not good. Okay, last one from me. Gender pay. We know that there were well-publicised cases, 2018, Carrie Gracie, 2020, Samir Ahmed won a tribunal. In the last century, I do recall Connie Huck being paid less than her male counterparts on Blue Peter. I know the gender gap is reducing. Is there a year when it will be zero? I mean, in our job, we're all paid the same thing. We're on a national scale.
I mean, gender pay is a complicated issue, and it also has to look at functions as well. So, for example, it's well known that technology, there are more men than women in that, in terms of the industry put broadly. We have more than 50% employees now who are women, in more than 50. We've passed 50% in terms of women at the BBC. What is absolutely critical is that people are paid the same whether they are men or women for fulfilling the same task, and get evaluated on the same basis. That is something we look at the board, and if we find that the indicators beg questions, then we ask those questions.
So you are striving to
Yes,
completely
absolutely.
release it. Okay, that could be a way to reduce some of this reputational damage from the murky loan affair.
Thank you. Trying to pull things together and being as charitable as possible, you took an action that would make the Prime Minister very personally grateful to you while you were applying for a sensitive job which was in his gift, and you didn't tell anyone about this. As I say, being as charitable as possible, wasn't that an error of judgment?
What I undertook was to ensure that good process was followed. As I said, I sought to put Mr. Blythe in touch with Mr. Case, and I then discussed with Mr. Case the implications of that. I had a long-established relationship with the Prime Minister, which was based upon professional respect. I'd served, actually, for him in 2 separate functions when he was the Mayor of London. And then in addition, I was working on significant activities when I was in Downing Street during the pandemic. And so I was comfortable in my mind that the Prime Minister knew me professionally, and that as far as I was concerned, the action that I was doing was to put his cousin in touch with the Cabinet Secretary. And that is as far as it went.
So you would do it all the same again?
Well, obviously I've had a lot of time to consider in the last few weeks my participation in this, in seeking to ensure that all the rules were followed. And I wish we weren't where we are now.
So you wouldn't have done?
Well, I think I will continue to consider the actions I took. What I do know is I acted in good faith to ensure that the rules are followed, and in that sense I have no regret for that. I clearly underestimated the way things could be seen, particularly in light of when they were described with facts that weren't true. So, for example, I took no part in any financing. I took no part in arranging the financing. I wasn't party to it. I simply put Mr. Blythe together with Mr. Case to ensure due process was followed. And to that extent, I don't regret the fact that I informed Mr. Case that due process should be followed. But clearly, I could have said to him, as I think Mr. Brennan said, find your own way to Mr. Case.
Do you wish you'd done that now?
Well, I think you can form your own judgment on that.
Right, thank you. Richard Sharp, thank you very much for giving evidence this morning. That concludes our session. Order.